I'll be reading in Genesis 8, but while you're turning, before I do, I want to take a moment to recognize Veterans Day this past Friday. For the men and women who have served our country and serve us today, I want to recognize and remember their sacrifice. I know I say this probably every time, but I mean it. To me, it doesn't matter whether you volunteered or you got drafted. It doesn't matter to me if you were in combat or if you were stateside behind a desk. When your country called, you answered, and you went, and you served. You are all heroes. I know those of you who have come back home, you don't think that. You think of the heroes who were not able to come back home. But if you served, you're a hero. And I just want to say thank you for your service. And for those of you who are veterans, if you would just take a moment to stand and let us recognize you. Bill, go ahead and stand up. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. We're
When I come back from Germany in '66, we weren't welcome back.
No.
We weren't welcome. But boy, the way people treat us now, the veterans now, is fantastic.
Yeah.
I just thank the Lord for it. I heard a guy come home from the honor flight this week, and he mentioned that. He said that they didn't get no reception when they come home, but boy, they sure got one when they come home from Washington.
Yeah.
And I just thank the Lord that people are just recognizing that it wasn't us that was doing the wrong.
That's right.
We were just doing what the country asked us to do.
Yep.
And I thank the Lord for the way people treat us now.
Yeah. In Genesis 13, I'll start reading with verse 1. And the title, I know the title is up there. I gave Doug and Debbie the wrong word. It should be dealing with reality, but I guess sometimes when we deal with reality, we deal with adversity, so it'll all work out. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he journeyed from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. This story really actually begins back up in chapter 12. There was a famine in Egypt, and Lot couldn't provide. There was a famine in Canaan, and Lot could not provide for his family. So without talking to the Lord about it, they went southwest to Egypt, where he could meet his own need. And while he was there, even though they were up in years, I guess Sarai was beautiful, his wife was beautiful, to the point where he said, now, if anyone asks about our relationship, you just tell them that you're my sister. What was he was afraid of was that someone would kill him, so she'd be a widow and they could marry her. And that happened quite a bit back then, I guess. And so Pharaoh heard about her, brought her into her own household, and God struck them with plagues to the point where Pharaoh deported Abram. Sometimes adversity becomes because it's self-inflicted. We bring it among ourselves. But sometimes life happens. And in chapter 13, Lot and Abraham had gotten so prosperous and things had worked out so well that they couldn't stay together. This passage carries with it the theme of struggle. And it's that struggle that's shaped around the separation that results from this. Abram is remembered and honored as a man of faith, and rightly so. But that does not mean that he lived in a dream world. Someone made a statement one time, and I heard this, and I've used it since from time to time. But they made a statement, and they felt that they needed to qualify it. They said, it's not a lack of faith. That's just reality. And it is sometimes. While there is a component of faith that is visionary, that believes in the unseen, men and women of biblical faith are grounded in reality. To have faith does not mean that you take complete leave of your senses, though other people may look at you and think that you have. I remember when I was called to preach in high school, some of my cousins thought that I had joined this cult and I had lost my mind. But regardless of our level of faith, there are times where we stagger. And sometimes there are times where we fail in our faith. And when we do, we need to deal with that reality and act accordingly. 3 things that we need to deal with when it comes to dealing with reality and or adversity. First of all, we have to deal with failure. We have to deal with failure. When Abram went down to Egypt, he was a wealthy and prosperous man. And when he was deported by Pharaoh out of Egypt, he was super wealthy, enriched with gold and treasures and livestock from Egypt. There are some people who would have said, wow, close call. You dodged a bullet there, but you landed on your feet and you came out ahead. So it was a little lie, but look how much better off you are. You made a great business decision. That's baloney any way you slice it. And I'm glad that Abram didn't buy it. And the reason why I don't believe that he bought it, because Abram's unsettled. If we could read it in the original Hebrew this morning, it indicates that Abram traveled in stages. He left Egypt and he went to the Negev. And he traveled around down there. He didn't just go to one area and plant. He wandered in that wilderness. He was very unsettled. There was something churning inside of him. And I believe it was because he is beginning to evaluate his life in spiritual terms, not just in secular or business terms. And he finally reaches a point where he leaves the Negev and he returns to Bethel. He returns to the altar. He comes back home to God. And when we stumble, when we fail in our faith, when those moments come where we need to fix our soul, we need to come back to God in repentance. We need to come back to the basics that build and strengthen faith and renew our commitment to the Lord. There are times when reality bites, so to speak, that we shouldn't be looking for a silver lining, but instead we should be looking up to the Lord. So we deal with failure, and we come clean with it, and we come back to God. The second thing that I see here is dealing with friction. Abram now had to deal with the uncomfortable fact that the promised land did not appear to be didn't appear to be living up to its promise. It didn't appear that what God was doing didn't fit or line up with what he had promised. There seemed to be some kind of gap there. And I believe that this was a test of faith to see if Abram had truly learned the lessons of Egypt and come to the place of really trusting God. The problem was not having too little. It was actually having too much. There was no famine going on, but because Abram and Lot had prospered so much, the area could no longer sustain them both. They could have continued to stay together and move out of the area to greener pastures, but Abram believed that this is where God wanted him to be. Some people respond to friction by attacking the other person and causing permanent damage to that relationship. Others deny that there's anything wrong and they stuff the anger down inside, making provision for a bitter future. Others admit something's wrong, but they tell the wrong people, and it makes the situation worse. Abram shows us how to handle the friction of daily living, whether it's at work or in the church or in our home. First of all, he's honest. He acknowledges that there is a problem. Second, he addresses the issue rather than attacking Lot. He doesn't come off and say, if you hadn't been so ambitious, if you hadn't been so materialistic, we wouldn't have this problem. No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't assign blame, and he doesn't make it personal. The third thing, and this is really key, the most important thing to Abram was not that he won the argument. The most important thing was maintaining his relationship with Lot. And because that was most important, Abram is flexible. He doesn't have to have things only his way. He wants a situation that's going to work well for both men. And fifth, he doesn't throw his weight around. In that culture, he is the leader of the clan. So by rights, he can say, this is what I am going to do, and this is what you are going to do. And Lot would have very little to say about that. Instead, he safeguards Lot's dignity, and he treats him with respect. And then the last thing that I see here is that he's more concerned about God's will than maintaining his rights or looking out for self-preservation. Excuse me. Abram, he had the right to choose. But by giving that right to choose to his nephew, he put himself at a disadvantage. He ended up settling for less on the outside than what he could have had. But it was more important for him to remain where God wanted him to be. And this really becomes the turning point in Abram's life. Because Lot chooses the well-watered plain, what he left Abram with was the desert highlands, where there's very little water, where there's very little grass. From a human standpoint, it's impossible for him to meet his need, but it's most important for him that he does God's will, and in this moment, he makes God his total resource. And it is the turning point in his life. We need to resolve our differences in the same way. And then finally, we need to deal with facts. As men and women of faith, we should never be afraid of facing facts. Like Abram, we have to face the fact that some situations just won't work out. They just won't. There was simply no way that Abram and Lot could live in the same area. The land could not handle them both. And no amount of denial or wishful thinking or spiritualizing would ever change that. When something is no longer workable, when something is no longer sustainable, we must have the courage to face that reality and bring about change, even if in the process it causes some pain and discomfort in the beginning. We also must face the fact that people will hurt and disappoint us. We will do that to each other, and not intentionally. But what I see here is Abraham, he extended respect, grace, courtesy to Lot. We do not see Lot returning it back to Abram. Maybe he did, but I don't see any thank yous here. There's nothing recorded in that. And what Lot really should have done was said, no, uncle, I appreciate it, but you are the leader of the clan. You have this right. I'm not going to take that opportunity to make the decision. It belongs to you. But instead of that, he didn't do that. Without any words of thanks or appreciation, he immediately acts out of self-interest. Instead of seeking and trusting God, the text tells us Lot chose for himself. It's obvious he didn't learn the lessons of Egypt. He was primarily concerned with the economic advantage in increasing his bottom line. And although Abram probably had adopted his nephew, Lot sure didn't want to stick around. He moved 40 miles to the east to get away from as far as he could from his uncle. And since he settled in Sodom, a place known even then for its great wickedness, makes me kind of wonder if he was trying to run from God too. And just as an aside, the land where Lot chose to live is the Jordan Valley. Today, it is sparsely populated. It is desert wasteland. But archaeologists have determined in ancient times it was one of the richest, most fertile areas of Palestine. The sites that they have excavated show several ancient cities that they discovered, two of which appear to be destroyed rather suddenly. Archaeology never contradicts the Bible. Whether it's in our nation, whether it's in our families, whether it's in our own individual lives, regardless of what we may face, we must recognize that God's purpose will prevail. It will. God's call upon us, the New Testament tells us, is irrevocable. In other words, the reason why we are saved today is because the Holy Spirit drew us. He called us to himself, and we responded to that call. And so if God's call is irrevocable, it means there will never be a time where God says, you know, I'm tired of CD. I'm just going to kind of leave him behind here. Or I'm tired of Joe, or I'm tired of Tracy. Too much of a burden, too much of a headache. No. He's not going to abandon you. He's not going to leave you behind. His call is irrevocable. And his promise, the promises that he has made to us, are steadfast and sure. The Lord was committed to completing what he had promised in Abram's life. And I say that this is the turning point because when Abram made God his total resource, God appears to Abraham. He restates his promise of Genesis 12, and then he expands it. Your descendants will be like the sand of the sea. It doesn't matter how the outward circumstances appear. God's plan will prevail. How does Abram respond? He stayed in the land. He built another altar, publicly declaring his faith and his devotion to the true and living God. In that heathen culture, everyone who would pass by and ask, what is the meaning of these stones in this wood? Abram would say, it is an acknowledgement of the God that I serve. It doesn't matter what our circumstances may be or what our resources may be. We too have this promise that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ. What is the day of Jesus Christ? It is that day when he comes back and the saints are rewarded and the wicked is punished and the scales are balanced. So it is a word to us to keep an eternal perspective in our living. That no matter what reality may bring us, he is coming back. And his plan for us, his purpose for us, will be made complete at that time. Reality. It's not always pleasant, but it is always present. And I think that's important for us in a time with our technology where we have metaverse and all of these different games and tools where we can create our own alternate reality. And many people do because it's too scary out there. Reality is not an enemy of our faith. Rather, it's an opportunity for our faith to demonstrate its character. So we face our failures. We face our friction. And we face the facts. And Jesus helps us. Let's stand.